Hello. Thank you for making the choice to join us here at the Greenbrier Church Online. You know, it always amazes me how things work out. This past week, as I was studying for our text today, our Hispanic minister, Cristobal, was working with several people who are going through the process of becoming United States citizens. Since our offices are so close, I can often hear them talking, but because their conversations are normally in Spanish, I don't understand a whole lot of what's being said. But this week was different. There was a lady who's about to take her citizenship test, and Cristobal is going over the public oath that's required for all naturalized American citizens. It was the first time that I'd ever heard the oath, and as we get started today, I want to share a part of that oath with you. It says, I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure any allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen, that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, so help me God. You know, there's something about an oath, especially that one, that resonated with me as I was reading our text for this morning. At the end of chapter 3, Paul uses this analogy of citizenship to show that as citizens of heaven, we should live differently than the people that are citizens of the earth. You may remember a few weeks ago when we began this study of the book of Philippians, I told you that Philippi was a colony of Rome situated in Macedonia. Since Philippi was a colony of Rome, the people living there were not Macedonians, they were Romans. Their official language was the language of Rome. They didn't dress like Macedonians, they dressed like Romans. They were loyal to the Roman government. I mean, when they tucked their children into bed at night, they didn't tell them about Macedonian stories, they told them bedtime stories about Roman heroes. They might have been living in Macedonia, but their allegiance was to Rome. They placed their faith and their identity in their Roman citizenship. Yet Paul's reminding them that when they gave their lives to Christ, they basically took an oath. And their new oath stated that they would voluntarily renounce all allegiance to any foreign prince, state, or sovereignty of whom or which they had previously been subject or a citizen. In more biblical language, they made an oath that they would love the Lord their God with all of their heart, all of their mind, all of their body, all of their soul, and all of their strength. Today we are also citizens of a different country, and we're merely temporary visitors on this colony that we call Earth. That's the metaphor. That's the idea behind Paul's usage of the term. But there's another group in the city of Philippi that are doing their best to blend in. They tried to dress the part, use the right words, say the right things, but they hadn't kept their oath. Paul says they're false citizens. In chapter 1, he says they have false motives. In chapter 3, he says they're dogs, people who do evil. And now he's going to call them enemies of the cross. So in these 5 verses today, Paul's going to talk about those people that are truly citizens of heaven, those who have pledged their full allegiance to God, and those that are non-citizens or people that are trying to have dual citizenship. In verse 17, Paul writes that we're to pattern your lives after mine and learn from those who follow our example. So Paul says the first mark of a true citizen is that they practice discipleship. Now, Paul's not being arrogant here. He just said that he had not already achieved these things or he's not already reached perfection. He's not putting himself on a pedestal above them. He's placing himself on a platform next to them. And he's saying, just as I'm striving to pursue Christ with all of my being, I invite you to join me on this journey to the perfection for which Jesus Christ first possessed me. Paul understands that we're all pilgrims on a journey towards heaven, but we're not strong enough to make the trip on our own. We need people who've walked the walk before us, people that will walk beside us and show us the best path to take. Because sometimes the journey gets hard and sometimes it gets lonely on this road. It's really nice to have people around us who encourage us and show us how to walk. I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with folks who are involved in AA as well as Celebrate Recovery. In every successful and lasting recovery program, there's this understanding that we have to walk with someone else. They call them sponsors. We know that a person will never get clean unless they have a sponsor that can serve as a motivator, an encourager, and most of all, someone that will hold you accountable to living a life that's clean. Using New Testament language, Jesus talks about discipleship. If we want to grow in our relationship with Christ, we also need a sponsor. We need somebody who's a disciple who will help us be disciples. You weren't invited into this relationship with Christ with the expectation that you would walk this path alone. We're called the body of Christ, the family of Christ. Jesus always uses community language. We're not supposed to live this life alone or isolated. We're called to walk with one another. I read about a group of conservationists that were working in Zimbabwe back in the 60s, and apparently this population of elephants was growing so large there was concern that the land wouldn't be able to provide for the elephants and the other animals. So these conservationists decided that their best option was to go out and kill off some of the older male elephants and allow the young bull elephants to take over. But as soon as they did that, they noticed they had another bigger problem. Because there was a herd of endangered white rhinos in the area, and the white rhinos began to be killed off, not by poachers, but by the young bull elephants that had grown aggressive. In their attempt to solve one problem, they created a larger issue. And as we tend to do, they made another bad decision. They decided that they needed to kill off the youngest bull elephants, but that just made the matters worse because now the remaining young bull elephants began to kill the female elephants. Somebody finally suggested what they needed to do was to go out and capture some older male elephants and introduce them into this area. In a matter of days, the young elephants stopped being aggressive. They fell back into line and started behaving the way they were supposed to behave. What the conservationists realized is that the young elephants, they didn't know how to act without the example of the older male elephants. You know that's not just true with elephants, right? In Titus 2, Paul calls the older and more mature members of the church in Crete to instruct and to demonstrate what it means to live out their faith. Each and every one of us are being called to mentor the people that are coming behind us and to listen to those that have gone before us. We need to live our lives in such a way that when the younger citizens see us, they see what it means to be loving and compassionate, forgiving, faithful. We need to walk with one another. We need to learn from one another so that we can develop communities of faith that practice real discipleship. Paul continues in verse 18, "For I have told you often before, and I say it again with tears in my eyes, that there are many whose conduct shows they are really enemies of the cross of Christ. They are headed for destruction. Their God is their appetite. They brag about shameful things, and they think only about this life here on earth." Paul says the second mark of a true citizen is that they live a counterculture life. Every day it seems that our news has another story about the crisis at our border. We understand all too well that just because somebody is living in the borders of a country, that doesn't really mean that they're citizens of that country. And just because somebody's a citizen by birth, that doesn't mean that they're loyal citizens. You can live in the general population and look like everybody else and still be hostile. Paul says, we've talked about this before, but I've got to address it again, this time with tears in my eyes. But he's not weeping for himself. He's weeping for the church because he knows the outcome could be catastrophic. And so once again, he warns them about these fake citizens that are trying to blend in, but they're not conformed to life as a citizen. You know, we could probably take a few weeks and look at all the different times that this issue pops up in the church. In Acts 8, we learn about a fake believer named Simon. In chapter 13, there's another fake believer named Elymas. In the letter to 1 Timothy, Paul mentions false teachers 3 different times. He specifically mentions Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom he says deliberately violated their consciences and shipwrecked their faith. In Peter's second letter, it has a short 3 chapters, but 2 of them are basically about false teachers and false prophets within the church. He says, there are false teachers among you who bring in destructive heresies. That's just a few of the texts. There are lots of others we can go to, but I'm sure you get the point that scattered in among every church, there are people who are trying to look the part. They just refuse to give up their allegiance to the world. They really have no allegiance to Christ at all. The Puritan preacher William Gurnall said, there are people who love God in their mouth, but the world is in their hearts. Paul would call them enemies of the cross of Christ. The church in Philippi is not immune to the fact that there are people in the community that are professing to be Christians, but they're not really living up to what they profess. Now, I think it's easy for us to understand why pagans or outsiders would live like the world. There's no reason for us to believe that people who are living away from Christ would live a life of holiness. We expect that the pagans would reflect the brokenness and the sinfulness of the culture in which they live. But Paul's not talking about the people out there. Paul's talking about the people in here. Paul's moved to tears because there are people who claim to be Christians, they just didn't live like Christians, and they were causing a great deal of harm to the church. They were saying one thing, maybe they were writing something on their social media or had a bumper sticker on their car, but they were living like the world and they were making the kingdom look bad. Tristan and I were working with a community that's about 200 miles from where I am right now. And there was another church in town that made the decision to sell their church van. This young man offered to buy the van, and the church said, that's great, we'd love to sell it to you, but do you mind taking the name of the church off the van? And the young man said, oh, I'm going to paint it, no big deal. But he never painted the van. What he did do was rip all the seats out of the back and put a mattress back there, and he would often park the van on the side of the road or in a parking lot and sleep. There were always an abundance of beer cans or smoke billowing outside the windows of that van. My friend who worked for the church said that they received 4 or 5 calls a week from people who were complaining about their church based on what they saw happening with their old church van. And since the man owned the van, the church discovered there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. The church was getting a bad reputation because somebody was doing and acting like the culture with the name of their church on the side of the van. And everyone assumed that the guy who owned the van was a member of God's kingdom, but he really belonged to the culture. Today, Paul wants us to take a moment and ask ourselves, are you a true citizen of heaven, or are you merely pretending to be a disciple? I mean, you know the right verbiage, you clean up real nice once a week, you keep your name out of the paper, but do you have a desire to give your life to the one who first gave his life to you? Finally, Paul writes in verse 20 that we are citizens of heaven, which, well, that's the third mark of a true citizen. We long for home. Honestly, when I read that we're citizens of heaven, I naturally think that Paul's saying that we're waiting for the time that we can go and live in heaven where we belong. But the more I read it, the less sure that I am that that's what Paul's talking about. It helps me to remember Paul's writing to a colony of Rome, and if somebody in Philippi said, I'm a citizen of Rome, I don't think they meant that they were longing and waiting for the time that they could move back to Rome. The whole reason that they're living in that colony is because the Roman government intended for them to take the Roman culture and influence into that part of the world. I'm beginning to think that Paul's echoing what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Living as a citizen here on earth, we're longing for the time when we get to go home and live with God for all eternity. But until that time comes, we're given this wonderful opportunity to bring a little bit of heaven to our culture here. Paul says that we're eagerly awaiting for Jesus to return, and as a citizen, we're longing to see our King. I think if you were to ask somebody living in the United Kingdom if they want to meet Prince William and Kate, you'd see excitement, some longing in their eyes. You see, they're an English citizen. They have an affection for members of the royal family. But I live in America, and I'm not really all that interested in a meet and greet with the royal couple. I'm not a citizen of that country. In the same way, if you're not a citizen of God's kingdom, then you have very little interest in the return of Jesus. Actually, when you think about it, you don't have much affection for Jesus at all. But if you are a citizen of that kingdom, you can't wait to see your King. But you understand that while you're living here, it's easy to get a little homesick. When we were living in Texas, I was given the wonderful opportunity to go to Gosford, New South Wales in Australia and to teach at a college for a few weeks. I was really excited about the opportunity. I mean, it was the first time that I ever had to get a passport. I was looking forward to the experience of the culture and the country, and the first week that I was there, I absolutely loved it. I got to eat kangaroo, I had afternoon tea, I went to the Sydney Opera House, I got to hike the Three Sisters in the Blue Mountains, but it didn't take long before I started missing the comfort things that I enjoyed, like Mountain Dew or a proper hamburger. I really missed Trista, and we talked every day through FaceTime, but it just made me miss her more. I was homesick, and I longed for my family and my friends and all of the things that I was used to. I think it's the same for a true citizen of heaven. We're always just a little homesick. We long for the time that Jesus will take our weak mortal bodies and change them into glorious bodies like his own, using the same power with which he will bring everything under his control. I love that Paul ends the section by saying that Christ will transform our lowly body when we get home. Not only are we going to change locations, we're going to change the way we look. We're going to be transformed into better. If you were to go out today and to conduct a poll and to ask people, if you could change one thing about your life, what would it be? It probably wouldn't surprise you that an overwhelming number of people would say that they want to change something about their physical appearance. They would say, if I could change one thing about my life, I'd want to be taller or thinner or have more hair or fuller lips or less wrinkles. And Paul says that's going to happen one day. Every citizen of heaven is going to get a resurrected, glorified body that's better than any facelift, skin cream, Botox, or diet plan known to man. Paul says we will be transformed, that God will transform our lowly body into a body that will never wear out, never get tired, never get exhausted, never get sick, never have to deal with handicaps or aches or pains of any kind. I mean, can you imagine having a body that never gets fat, never loses hair, never gets wrinkled or sags or stoops, because we'll be in the Father's house where perfection exists and perfection is seen in everyone. As we get ready to make our way to the tables today, we're going to have to answer the question about our citizenship. God invites every one of us to his table, but just because we take a seat at his table doesn't mean that we are living like a citizen of heaven. As we take the bread and we take the cup, we're being reminded of what God has already accomplished in this world so that we could claim our true citizenship. So as you take the emblems, I want you to make sure that you are living like a citizen of heaven. You're practicing discipleship, you're living counter to the culture, and you're longing for heaven. because Jesus has already paid the price for our citizenship. But we have to do the work of living like a citizen of heaven in this culture. I really hope that you have a wonderful time around the table today, that you're able to be with people who love you, people that you love, and you're able to have a great conversation about what it means to live out your life, affection, and faith in Jesus Christ. Please never forget what God has done to show you how deeply you're loved. Go in peace, and I look forward to seeing you next week.